If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what is the creepiest / strangest / scariest experience you ever had in your life? I moved into my current home 3 years ago. We originally planned to not have a TV in the bedroom and have a cool hangout spot in the main living room, and the kids had a separate den. This worked out well for maybe the first 6 months to a year. I started to not like watching TV at night in the living room. There was something wrong with the lighting in there and it just bothered me. It felt like the normal shadows in there were constantly moving. After a few weeks of just being quiet about that and the weird bumps and noises, I finally said something to my so. He seemed relieved that I could see it too. It always looked like someone was walking back and forth behind us when we were on the couch, and sometimes we'd see the silhouette of something reflected on the TV. Now we avoid the living room at night, but have noticed a weird dark shadow in the shape of a tall person in our bedroom doorway. It never fully comes into the room, but it really creeps us out. Our pets react to it too. About a month and a half ago, I decided to do laundry late at night. It's about 1 a.m. My parents decided we needed to move to a smaller town last year, and the property they got has a small in-law suite on it from the 70s. Not fancy but comfortable, and I liked it. So I live in it. I have to do laundry in the main house. I go to get the laundry as it had finished drying 10 to 15 minutes before I went to get it. I leave the in-law suite and immediately hear birds chirping and what sounded like people laughing. It's 1 a.m. and all of my neighbors work early. And it was during the week. So I was confused but still went to get my clothes. I came out of the house and the bird was still going crazy. Then a female voice was clearly talking in my direction. Now the bird that was chirping wasn't one of the nocturnal birds in my area. And it was definitely way too late anyway for this bird to still be up making noise. The woman's voice seemed to get louder and I could see a shadow in the corner of my eye. The shadow was on the edge of a dark area the street lamps couldn't hit. So I just kept my eyes focused on my front door and continued towards, but with a bit more pep in my step. I'm positive that night I ran into a cryptid. Or more accurately put, watched by a cryptid. Since then I've had the hair on the back of neck stand straight up when outside later at night like I was being watched and could sense it. And my girlfriend has seen people on top of our neighbors' roofs. Needless to say, I think there's a Native American folklore cryptid stalking either me or someone near me. Worked at our college's info desk for AV stuff, and there was always another info desk person there with us. Around 9:50 p.m. a girl comes up and says that she was leaving the planetarium, about 750 feet down the hallway and around a corner from our desk, and heard a weird noise down a hallway and went to take a look. As she went partway down the hallway the lights started to flicker and then she noticed what looked like blood drops on the floor leading down the hallway and peaced out. We figured it was just a spilled drink and grabbed our radio to go look and radio the janitorial crew. We get there and the entire wing is dimly lit and the hallway lights are about 15% as bright as they should be and flickering like when someone is about to get murdered in a horror film. The door at the end was partially open and we did hear what sounded like metal hitting against something coming from it. We saw drops and it was more like a small trail of it, was definitely red but didn't have the color of blood, it was more orange colored than a deep red. After a louder noise right as we turned our phone's flashlights on to investigate, we also pieced the hell out of there and radio campus police. They took a brief statement and we locked up the info desk for the night and left. Never did find out what it was. A few years ago I was walking my friend home from the pub. She lived further away than me, but she was significantly drunker and I didn't want her to walk by herself in the dark. A guy we both knew was at the pub too, and we'd known him for ages, been to school together, etc., but we definitely weren't close. He was one of those really weird kids, but not in a lovable quirky goofball kind of way, if that makes sense. Like scary weird. Anyway, he tagged along with us for the walk home, and it was fine because we'd been having a laugh with him all night and he genuinely seemed very different to how he had been in school. However, once we'd reached my friend's house and dropped her off, his tone changed. He started telling me about how if his future girlfriend ever cheated on him, he would kill her, and I can't explain exactly how, but from his tone and demeanor and everything I didn't doubt that for a second. He then proceeded to tell me that if he wanted to, he could easily kill me right now, and dispose of the body in a way that no one would ever find me. All this was being said whilst we were walking down a mile-long pitch-black country road in the middle of nowhere, no streetlights, no houses near the road, literally no one else around. Got lost on a 14-mile hike because of a faded sign and poorly marked branching trails. It wasn't a high-traffic hiking trail since it was mid-July and hit temperatures of 105 F at high noon. We left early in the morning to avoid the afternoon heat, but getting lost put us 4 miles off track. So once we got back to the right trail, it was perilously close to noon on a moderately difficult return trail. My friend and I had enough water for the normal trail length, but nowhere near for the extra time spent out in the extreme heat. Heat exhaustion swiftly set in and our water went quickly. We would move from shaded spot to shaded spot when we could, but there was little tree cover for the last 7 miles. Eventually it got so bad I collapsed in a semi-fetid pool of standing water to cool off as best as I could. I remember sitting there, nauseous, shaking and barely able to stand, thinking we were going to die out there because we read the wrong trail sign and got off course. Thankfully, a group came down the trail, saw us and immediately offered water and assistance to get us the last couple miles out and back to our vehicle. What was supposed to be a 4-hour hike turned into 10, I lost 13 pounds, my feet were covered in blisters and sores, and I was so weak I couldn't get out of bed for days. So yeah, that was terrifying. My cousin's mom had a twin who died in her early 20s. She passed away in a trailer right behind the house they had grown up in. When I was 15, I went to visit my cousins for a week at that house. It was my first time going there as it was a couple hours away and my uncle and their mom had split when we were little, and I'd only ever gone to his house before. When it was time for bed, my 2 cousins, my aunt, and I all piled into my aunt's bed. I didn't question why we weren't sleeping in one of my cousins' rooms. I figured maybe it was cause they just got home from their dads and had missed their mom. The next evening we decided to play hide and seek. I walked down the hallway towards my younger cousin's room. Her door was ajar and her room was dark. I heard whispering. There were some lumps on the bed that I knew from seeing earlier in the daylight as stuffed animals, but I thought maybe my cousins were hiding among them. I got closer and the whispering stopped. I was suddenly terrified and couldn't bring myself to enter her room. I yelled out, "I can hear you guys whispering." From down the hall, in the living room, I heard my cousins go, "What?" They weren't in the younger cousin's room. I turned and booked it to the living room. One had been hiding behind the TV and the other had been hiding behind the couch. Not close enough to whisper to each other. And I wouldn't have heard them anyway, as far down the hallway as I had been. My cousins told me that my younger cousin's room had been their mom's twin's room when she was a kid. They said the room creeped them out, and that's why they slept in their mom's room at the other end of the house. I stayed the hell away from that room the rest of the visit. But they only had one bathroom in the house, in the middle of the hallway. So if I had to pee in the middle of the night, I'd have to walk down the pitch black hallway using my phone screen as a flashlight, terrified the whole way. Scary/strange. When I was around 10 or 11, we lived in this old pier and beam house originally built in the 40s. I loved that house. It had a large detached garage and a huge backyard. But the problem was I would have these horrendous nightmares. That was until I taught myself how to lucid dream. Before anyone says anything about how did a 10-year-old learn how to lucid dream, it wasn't on purpose. I just realized I was in a dream and night by night, slowly started figuring out how to mess around in them. After I figured out how to control my dreams, the nightmares still came, but I would change the dream, like scare off the T-Rex chasing me, etc. I kept changing my dreams night after night. But then, I started seeing things in the house, while I was awake. The first was a low glowing figure, the second was a white hand that thrust out at me as I was walking to the hallway and stopped me from going in my room, but the third was 2 beings in the corners of my ceiling. They were there for a while. One light and one dark. They seemed like they were having a conversation with each other in whispers that I either couldn't hear, or understand. As a grown adult now, I always just thought I had a ridiculous imagination, which I did, but the thing is, I still remember those experiences, in vivid detail. Far beyond what an imagination should be able to produce. I also don't dream anymore, and if I do, I don't remember them. I stopped dreaming after we left that house. I found out about 10 years ago that the detached garage used to be a church. My mom wouldn't tell me the type of church, but I had that feeling that this wasn't your run-of-the-mill Southern Baptist church. To this day, I still wonder if it was just my imagination or if I saw something no one else could. I swear to God and on my life this happened to me. The first memory I have ever is fucked up. I was still in a crib. I can't remember how old I was, but I know I was alone because my brother was still newborn, so I was 2 or 3 years old. I guess I woke up from sleeping and it was dark in the room. My crib was on the back end of the room. The hallway light was on. Then a creature slowly walked into the doorway. I couldn't see it very well at first because the light was behind it. Its form reminded me of a short humanoid with a wide head, more like a hammerhead. It creeped up silently, no sounds, no menace at all. It came into view for me and it had inhumanly large eyes, yet still they had the whites and brown iris, and a wide mouth. It was gray and kind of sickly looking. After that, the last thing I remember is screaming harder than I ever have or ever will. It just turned its head slightly, kind of like a dog that's listening to what you're saying. The memory fades after that point. I still have dreams about it. Sometimes it makes me freak out and cry even as a grown-ass man. It was more real than any of my other memories. When I tell this story, no one believes me. I guess it could have been my wild, childhood imagination. It's as real as every other childhood memory I've had though. Sometimes when my mind is quiet, I still think about it. I wouldn't say creepy or strange, but I live in an area with practically no tornadoes ever. A few years ago I was working for a construction company, mostly roofing, that was owned by my HS football coach, so I had a pretty good in to get the job. We would routinely check the weather because no one wants to shingle when it's really windy or rainy. One day the forecast showed 90 degrees Fahrenheit and no clouds all day with 10 miles per hour wind. Hardly humid, either. Around 3 p.m. we noticed some storm clouds rolling in and thought, we weren't supposed to get any rain or a storm today, and started packing up. As I was driving home, there was golf ball sized hail hitting the windshield of my pickup. I sped home, and as I was walking from the garage to the house, I looked west at the clouds and saw a massive tornado about half a mile wide headed straight towards town. My heart was racing and I was freaking out. Jumped down into the basement as quickly as I could and waited. 20 minutes later, after it sounded like a train was right outside my house going 100 miles an hour, I walked upstairs to dead calm wind and a slight rain. The tornado missed the whole town by about a quarter mile north. Trees were uprooted around town and one of the trees in my front yard was split in half, the half on the ground blocking the whole street. I've never been in a tornado situation, so this is probably normal for a lot of people in the Midwest, but when I say I was terrified, I truly was. Still don't think I'll ever shake the sound it made. This happened back when I was like a junior in high school. My mom used to water the front garden early in the morning with the dog, and because my room was right next to where the hose connects to the house, I could hear when she turned on the water. Well, it's like the second or third day of the school year and I hear the water turn on and heard the family dog bark. I wake up to the noise and notice it's still really dark out. I thought it was strange that my mom was watering so early since she usually waits until the sun has at least risen, and I also thought it was strange that the dog had barked because she wasn't known to bark very much. I get up and walk to my window to peek out the blinds to see if my mom was still outside since the water stopped. When I looked outside, I didn't see my mom or the dog, but at the end of our driveway and right next to our mailbox I see a little girl sitting on the sidewalk with her head down. I was beyond confused. It's like 6 a.m. and no little girl that looks to be under the age of 10 should be outside alone. I decide to get a better look and decide the best way to do that is to go to the living room window. Mind you, this whole time I have not turned on a light and have only pushed the blind down enough to look through. I never turned on a light or actually opened any on the blinds I ended up looking through. I look through the living room blind and the little girl has lifted her head and is staring right at me. I could tell she was looking at me, but her eyes were just black. They looked like two black holes. She had no eyes at all. I was terrified. I was frozen for a moment just looking at this eyeless girl at the end of our driveway. I finally removed my finger that was holding the blind open and ran to my parents' room. I banged on the door and begged for my mom to come look. She could barely understand what I was saying, but went to look outside. I refused to enter the living room while she checked. She tried to open the front door to look, but I demanded she only look through the blinds. She looked through the blinds. Nothing. There was no little girl outside. I swore up and down that the little girl was there. I asked if my mom had gone out to water the garden that morning with the dog. She told me no. Her, my dad, and the dog had been asleep until I came knocking on the door. I was freaking out. My mom played it off like nothing was wrong and went to sleep for 30 more minutes. I've kinda always seen freaky stuff like this, but my mom never believes me when I tell her. This was just one of the scariest things I've seen. Was in Brazil as a missionary. My companion and I were walking down a long dirt road in a town called Palhoca, located near Florianopolis, and it was about midday. An older woman in her 60s runs out of her house and begs us to come in the house to see her son. She said he was sick and knew that we were men of God and that we could help him. We followed her confused, and were seated in her living room. Her and her husband told us that before we met her son they needed to tell us something before we met him. Their son had been in a car accident 3 years prior and had been injured. While he was pretty banged up, his injuries were not life-threatening. He had injured his leg and it had resulted in a limp. His parents thought the limp would absolutely ruin his life, so they began calling representatives from every religion they could think of to heal him. These religions included Catholic, Protestant, Krente, and even the Church of Satan and a local religion called Macumba. We would sometimes see members doing Macumba in houses, and they would dress in white, dance in circles, and cut the heads off chickens, and their clothes would get stained with chicken blood. Over the last 3 years, James had gone from having a slight limp to not being able to walk at all, and was confined to a wheelchair. Anyways, we didn't promise anything, but agreed to talk to the kid, who I'll call James. James was about 23 years old. When we walked in, I felt something I had never felt before. It was like the entire room has a different pressure to it. There was what I can only describe as a dark, oppressive aura in the room. I wanted to leave, but my companion, who was the senior, sat down and began to speak to him. I was still fairly new and didn't speak Portuguese very well yet, but my companion was fluent and had been out about a year. James told us his name was George, and that he didn't want our help. My companion said, "I thought your name was James." James replied, "James is only the name of this body, I'm George." I'm not sure what was said next, but my companion raised his arm to the square and commanded George to leave. The oppressive aura immediately subsided and James began to cry. I say cry, but it was more than that. He was sobbing uncontrollably and looked like he was in pain. He began to yell at my companion, asking him why he sent his only friend away. Then he began to yell that he needed George, and started yelling, "George, please come back, I need you." After a few seconds of yelling, the oppressive feeling and pressure returned even more than it had previously, and James looked straight at my companion and started talking to him in a monotone voice. I heard a couple of names that I recognized as my companion's girlfriend, as well as another family member back home in North America. My companion went white as a sheet, and looked at me and said, "We are leaving right now." We got up, left the room, shook off the questions from James' parents as we walked past, and left the house as quickly as we could. After we left, I asked my companion what James had said, and he told me that he had told him about something that had happened with his girlfriend back home before he had come in his mission. Something he hadn't shared with anyone, and there's no way James could possibly know. The whole experience sent chills down my spine. I never believed in possession before that day, but having lived through that experience, I 100% believe in it now. I've never felt that oppressive feeling since, and I hope I never do. I was cat sitting at an old lady's house back in high school, but before I could drive myself. Easiest job ever, plus got me away from home in the evenings and on weekends. Anyhow, one night I was watching TV on the recliner, with my back to the open sliding glass door, which was on the edge of the backyard and pool. It was probably 9 or 10 p.m. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a tall shadow along the back fence, which had some landscaping lights. What I saw was probably 15 feet behind me. I slowly closed the slider, turned off the TV and all the lights. I kept watching out the living room's window into the backyard as a man-like shadow walked left through the cypress trees along the back fence, all the way into the dark, far left corner. I freaked out, and the phone was right there on the wall, so I called my mom. Nope. Phone line is dead. I army crawled down the hallway to the computer and used the old school phone dialer program on Windows to try to call my family's line. There was no microphone to talk to them, but it was novel at the time, and I had just prank dialed them a few times from there the day before because I thought it was so cool. It wasn't, but anyhow, no dial tone, which confirmed it wasn't just a bad phone on the wall in the other room. So I figured the phone lines were out, which was terrible timing since there's a person sneaking in the backyard and I should probably call my parents, not 911, which is dumb. So I get up my courage, open the front door, quickly lock it behind me, so responsible, and run to the elderly next door neighbors I was told about. Old couple answers the door and invites me in. I ask if I can wait there until my mom presumably gets scared and drives over to get me. I mention that this is all on account of the phone lines being down. The old lady picks up her phone and says, "No, there's a dial tone." So I called my mom from there and got picked up a few minutes later. My mom was scared and I told her only about the phone line not working, just at the house I was sitting. The next day my mom had the phone company check the line. The wire was cut. To this day, I never told my mom about what I saw along the back fence, and I never even told the lady who employed me that the phone line was cut. But I always wonder what would have happened if I didn't see a shadow out of the corner of my eye. Gives me chills. During a long trip back from vacation in Missouri, I stopped at a gas station to get a Monster to stay awake about 11 o'clock at night. Upon arrival, a dude with a white motorcycle was sat at a pump, just looking at his phone. At the time I didn't think much of it, but when I went inside I saw that the only person working this rather large gas station was a young woman. I used the restroom, grabbed my drink and paid. On my way out I saw that man still at his bike. Something didn't feel right, so I kept an eye on him while fueling. He was still just sat there. I pulled my car up into a parking space and grabbed my revolver 9-shot 22 LR for anyone curious, and sat in my car and watched him. A solid hour passed. During that time he eventually filled his bike up but still just sat around, adjusting straps of his bag and scrolling on his phone in an endless manner. At about 1140 he went inside and from what I saw just spoke to the clerk for about a minute and a half. I left my revolver in the car and went inside fearing an altercation and throwing a gun in the mix. To add I wasn't 21 at the time was why I left it. When I went inside, he immediately turned to me and I locked eyes with him, and it was long enough for me to get to know everything I needed. He was afraid when he realized I was there. You could see it all over his face. I studied him for 2 seconds, a time that felt like eternity but long enough to get a feel and study his face. He reminded me of some of the more cowardly inmates you meet in jail and prison. Those who won't do shit unless they have a gang actively backing them in the moment or think they have a complete upper hand in a situation. After studying him for a couple of seconds, I turned and went to the drink aisle for another monster. As soon as I started making my way, he immediately left. I asked the clerk if everything was all right and she replied that it was, just the usual nighttime creeps. I told her I had been around for about 40 minutes and asked how long he'd been here. She said a while and that he'd been acting strange, hanging around and filled his bike twice. I asked if she had anything to protect herself with and she answered no. I told her that I wasn't local to the area, but that she should call the local sheriff's office and inform them of the character outside. With that I left, and saw that our dear friend in this story did as well. I waited around another 5 minutes and used the turnaround from the one-way highway to make sure he wasn't hanging around. On my way around I saw a deputy on their way on the roundabout to the gas station, so I left and continued my ride home. When I passed through town and made it to the other side, I glanced over to the last stop gas station at the edge of the town and saw from my highway, the same white coat, checking the bags of their bike at the pump as my highway continued left. About 15 years ago my, now ex-girlfriend and me were young, expecting an unplanned child and desperately searching for a home. Money was tight so we were on the crappier end of the house market, but we eventually found somewhere decent looking going for next to nothing. It needed work but it was close to where we both worked, the dentist, the doctors. Even the schools were about 10 minutes walk away. During the sale I learned the reason it was so cheap was the previous owner was found dead in the house. Never bothered to look into the details. Never told my ex either as I knew it would freak her out and we'd never get a deal as good as this again. We move in, things go good but the ex starts to experience things. Lights turning off by themselves, noises when home. Just little things and most of them have a practical explanation. Dodgy wiring on the electric, thin walls so we can hear the joining houses. The only weird thing I keep to myself is that there was a horrible stain on the upstairs carpet near the bedroom window when we moved in. I always wondered if that was where the previous owner died and lay potentially undiscovered for a while. I also always had nightmares if I fell asleep facing that way. The child grows up, develops an imaginary friend. Thomas. They play together, have fun, but then Thomas starts to become mean. The child says he hurts her, says mean things, says he's going to hurt me and her mom. One day the child comes downstairs upset. I ask if it's Thomas. She nods. I ask if she will show me where Thomas is. She nods, takes me into the main bedroom and points to the window. Where the stain used to be. Says he's sitting there, under the window. Not long after this she stops seeing Thomas. We have a new child but we're still in the same house. Financially we can't afford to move. The new child is born severely premature and has to sleep in the same room as us for several years. One night she's in bed in our room, starts crying over the monitor. I say I'll check on her. I usually just lie with her until she falls asleep. I go upstairs and she's clearly more distressed than usual. She can talk by this point so I ask her what's wrong. The man, she says, the man get me. What man? She points to the corner of the room. Under the window. That man there. The story that really still sends shivers down my spine is what happened to me when I was 8 yo. So one day my dad took me to this car show at a local casino lot. It was a drag race type show with tons of revving engines so it was loud. Well before the show my dad took me to the buffet for breakfast and noticed this creepy middle-aged man staring at me. Thing is my dad only noticed him because he was trying to read what the man's hat said, it had some weird symbol on it. We finished our meal and my dad and I walked to the car show unaware that this man was following us throughout the entire casino. Well, during the show I was kind of being a brat and my feet hurt, so I begged my dad to let me sit on the curb. At that age I didn't really care about cars, but my dad loved them. He told me, yeah sure, just don't go far. When my dad told me the story again, the way he says it is something inside him told him to turn around. He turned around and sure enough that man was standing right next to me staring at me. My father literally ran over, grabbed me, and told me we're leaving. As we headed back to our truck, he says he looked back and the man smiled and mouthed the words, "Almost got ya." I'm convinced that man was a serial child molester and probable serial killer. My dad still says that he has never experienced something that evil in his whole life except that day in BTW. I'm a grown adult, but I still won't go to that casino. Every time I see the casino I remember that day and I get chills in my spine, because had my dad not turned around I probably would have been kidnapped, tortured, and possibly murdered in some dude's basement. It still freaks me out and I'm almost 30 today. This was about 2 years ago now. Me, my brother, and my dad were camping out in the woods. This wasn't glamping with a fancy trailer and all that. This was bare-bone camping in a tent under the stars in the middle of the forest, maybe 40 kilometers from the nearest paved road. So anyways, it was about 1 o'clock in the morning when I heard the sound I will never forget. The loudest roar I have ever heard in my life. It felt like all the air inside me left. I looked over to my dad and all the color had drained from his face. We were both frozen, my brother's still asleep and I have no fucking clue how. This was a dead zone too, no reception for 80 kilometers from one town to the next. We were in the middle of that, except 40 kilometers in the forest. We didn't hear anything until about 2 hours later. I still was wide awake, completely shaken to the core, when I heard what sounded like a branch getting smashed against a tree. Then after that the night was silent. I got up and was afraid to walk 5 feet from the campsite, but I had to pee, so I went off a little ways into the woods. That's when the scent hit me. I can't describe it with words honestly. Needless to say, we got up and got back in the truck and got out of there as fast as we could. I still don't know what was in the woods with us that night. My friend and I were driving home the morning after a party. It was late morning and we were on a long boring highway that runs parallel to a river. My friend was driving my car and I was trying to rest in the passenger's seat when he starts to get anxious. I asked him what was wrong, and he pointed out an SUV behind us. He said it had been following us for a while. I laughed and reminded him this was a highway, and told him not to be paranoid. Then he said, no, watch this, and he slowed down to like 35 miles per hour. It was a 55 miles per hour speed limit. The SUV slowed down too. He sped up, so did the SUV. We considered stopping, but we knew that could open up a whole new can of worms. Now I am by no means the guy you want in a situation like this, but I'm also not a complete dummy. I kept a pistol in my glove box that I retrieved, and when we finally approached a red light, with the SUV behind us, I told my friend to put on his right turn signal. The SUV followed suit. Then, instead of turning right, we went straight. So did the SUV. Now it's clear they want us. At this point I have my gun in one hand and 911 dialed in the other, ready to make the call. In a stroke of genius my friend manages to whip the car across 2 lanes of traffic and get in the turning lane to a mall. The SUV couldn't follow that, and now they are next to us, with a car in the middle, at the light. I half expected to look over and see a couple rednecks laughing. In my neck of the woods it wouldn't be uncommon. Instead, 2 of the creepiest looking dudes I've ever seen just sat there staring straight ahead, not looking over at us once. When we turned into the mall parking lot we stayed there for about 30 minutes, ready and waiting for them to turn around and come back, but they never did. I don't know for sure what their plans were or why they were following us, but it was certainly a terrifying drive. I know this will sound like bullshit, but I promise that everything I'm about to tell you happened. There were these old buildings near us called the Indian schools. Apparently the Gov had forced a bunch of natives to attend school and get civilized in the early 1920-30s, and some bad shit went down, like students murdering a teacher and each other. Well, me and a few friends went one weekend night and found our way into one of the buildings through a big gaping hole in the wall. At first it was cool as shit. There was an old swimming pool in the basement that was creepy AF, and we found a room with some really impressive graffiti. Then, on our way to the dormitory area we ran into a low table with an inverted cross carved into it, and a bunch of small charred objects that turned out to be some kind of bones, likely small animal bones. At that point it just started to not feel right, if that makes sense. There was just this low-key feeling of dread that started to permeate the air, and the ruined hallways started to feel pretty ominous. We headed up some stairs and were faced with a long hallway full of doors, and that is when it started to get really weird. We started walking down the hallway, and looking in the rooms. They were small with 1 or 2 bed frames typically, and sometimes a small dresser-looking thing of some sort. And all the windows were boarded up. Every single window. We reached the end of the hall, and found that the stairwell down had partially collapsed, so we had to turn around and head back the way we came. As we started back down the hallway, suddenly we heard these loud footsteps that sounded like they were on the ceiling right below us. We stopped, and the footsteps continued for a couple seconds and ceased. Then as soon as we started walking again, the loud footsteps recommenced. We started walking faster to get TF out of there, when doors we were passing or had recently passed started slamming. Probably in all 4 to 5 doors slammed as we were now half running down the hall towards the exit. I don't know how that was even possible considering we had seen that all the windows were tightly boarded up. The footsteps got louder and louder until we ran back down the stairs and into the hallway with the altar, and then they stopped for good. We left at that point, but we went back to my house and sat around my table in absolute shock. None of us could explain what had just happened, and we felt like we had just survived some kind of near-death experience. The schools got torn down to put up houses shortly after, but to this day I cannot completely discount spirits, or demons, or any of that supernatural shit because I experienced it firsthand, and I know what I heard and felt. My ex-boyfriend, his 2 friends, and I were walking around a lake smoking a joint at his grandparents' house late at night and had an encounter with a bear in Prior Lake, Minnesota. Our talking had woke it up and I saw something large moving very high up in an old tree further down the trail back to his grandparents' house. When we got to this spot on the trail, it looked like there was a baby animal in our way on the path, so we stopped for about 2 seconds to try and make out what it was. Suddenly we heard a large animal charge aggressively towards us through tall grass coming from the trees. It was extremely dark out, so we didn't see what it was. We all just took off in different directions. The entire walk home we were all shaken to the core, and even my ex's friend, who is a 6'5", 250 pounds man, was trembling and walking backwards with a flashlight the entire time. Needless to say, this ruined our buzz. When we got home, we spent hours researching and eliminating what we thought it potentially was, and the only possible animal was a bear. The next morning we told my ex's grandparents about our encounter and they didn't seem surprised at all. They said, "Oh, there have been bear sightings all summer." We all agreed that nobody would ever understand how close we were to a bear that night. When I tell this story, people get skeptical, but I know what we all experienced that night. I had a lot of creepy experiences in my life, but the one that scared me the most was when I was like between 8 to 10 years old. It was so strange and scary that it was so unforgettable, and the fact that I almost died. It was during the night. I was in the bedroom with my mom. She was sitting near the wall while I was lying on my stomach at the edge side of the bed. She was talking with her friend. I was sleepy at that time, tuned out their conversation, and I was just staring at the electric fan that was facing me. I was staring at the spinning fan for quite a time, and suddenly I just couldn't breathe. I was losing consciousness. I couldn't breathe and couldn't even move a muscle. My heartbeat was getting slower. My mom did not notice something wrong with me, for effing sake. And then, I saw 2 perspectives. One is from my eyes, looking at the spinning fan. And one is from above the room. I can see the whole effing room. I saw myself lying in there, with my eyes so wide and my mouth open. My mom smiling and talking with her friend. What I hate the most is that, it was like I was making eye contact with myself as my heartbeat was slowing the F down. I felt my lungs screaming for air, and I was just shouting for help. It was like a very long time shouting at my mom to look at me and help me. But she did not. I was crying, and I swear I bet neighbors would have been woken up if I had voice at that time. I was so scared. I was praying, crying and screaming. I can still see everything, my eyes from my own body staring at the spinning fan and the all-seeing eyes I have in the room. And then, my heartbeat goes so slow and eventually stop. Then, I woke up with me staring at the spinning fan. I immediately sat up and took a huge lungful of air. My body was trembling, and I just cried. My mom went to my side and asked what was wrong. But I couldn't talk, it was so scary I couldn't even say a word. Eventually, I was able to calm down after a long time of crying and was able to somehow tell my mom what happened, and I don't think she believed me. But she told me to pray and went to church the next day. Up until now, it is still the most unforgettable memory I have in my life. I did share it at some few close friends, but no one did believe me.